My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God.
Good morning. Nice to see so many smiling faces in here. We will be in Romans chapter 9. After a month of telling you we were in Romans 8, we're now in 9. I do have a plan to finish Romans by the end of the quarter. Do I expect to be successful? That's another issue. So the chapters 9, 10, and 11, they kind of represent maybe the word I'm looking for is vindication of God's choices. Paul's going to defend and maintain God's right to choose, and we'll talk about that a lot this morning. It was very offensive to the Jews that God had rejected in the scriptures, the word's kind of fleshly, but it's the physical, sinful Jews, and had accepted the Gentiles. And so Paul, in this passage, and these passages, really reveal the basics of God's rejection and acceptance. Chapter 9 is a transformational or transitional passage in this letter. Up until now, Paul has been explaining that salvation under the law was impossible because the law was unforgiving of error. In other words, there was no way to resolve that. He's further shown so far in the letter that faith, not law, is the basis upon which God will justify the saved. Anyway, this idea of faith, the idea of you can't earn it, you've got to basically understand that you can't work your way into heaven. Not that it's not important, but God has established a process which most of us are familiar with. But the idea that God has basically made the Gentiles equivalent to the Jews is very upsetting to them. While it's encouraging to the Gentiles, it's very disappointing maybe to the point of being devastating to the religious perspective of the Jews. Yeah, Tommy?
Along that same line, not only were they mad that Gentiles had the opportunity, but they also were based on the wrong concept of if you're of the seed, we're all the same.
That's an interesting observation, because that's where we're going to be all morning. So let's get to it. Now, these first 5 verses, Paul really demonstrates his sympathy for the Jews. I mean, he is basically very concerned. And he starts right off, and understand that Paul, because of his upbringing, he's been taught to tell the truth. And so when he speaks these few things in these 5 verses, he basically wants the Jews to understand, I don't lie, and it's in good conscience I'm sharing these things with you. And most commentators that you look at, they really agree that this opening statement by Paul, I'm not lying, my conscience bears me witness, and in the Holy Spirit, this is not an oath. What this is an affirmation. He's very sincere, and he wants the Jews to understand the depth of his sincerity. And so he's about to say some things about the Jewish condition that might be hurtful. And so he's already established his position with regard to the Jews. He's already talked about what's going on. But here he's going to get more personal, as if he hasn't been personal enough. But Paul doesn't want to leave any doubt in the mind of the Jews regarding his love for the Jewish people. He are one. And so he was raised as one. He was schooled as one. He was very, very highly ingrained in the Jewish culture. Some of the Jews would probably accuse Paul of a personal vendetta against them. The leaders, the Jewish leaders, had exhibited some pretty extreme reactions to his preaching since his conversion. As a matter of fact, they didn't like that. They tried in every way they could stop him. Stop him from working with the Gentiles, even stop him from working among his own countrymen, because his objective was to get the Jews, as well as the Gentiles, focused on Jesus. And so there was a lot of reaction, a lot of pressure, a lot of pushing. But, you would have thought that Paul would have become very defensive and would have lashed out at the Jewish leaders, but that's not really what he did. He basically established his rhetoric based upon facts, and he used facts that were known by the Jews to establish his position. So that's a fairly big thing from a perspective of when I'm trying to convince somebody, I really need them to understand that I'm the knowledge expert in the room. So I have to, go into further detail. But, Paul did not lash out at him. He had nothing but sympathy for his brethren, his brothers, his fleshly brothers. If you read this, his heart broke with great sorrow. He was, even to the point, he says, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers. He's willing to give up Jesus if it meant his Jewish brothers would turn to Jesus. I mean, that's an unthinkable sacrifice that Paul wants to make. Tommy?
There's a lot of people who think that was the thorn of the flesh that Paul was talking about.
Tommy's got a good point that this idea that he would give up everything that, for his Jewish brethren might have been the thorn in the flesh that we talk about, that Paul had to suffer with. He really truly would have given up everything just if his Jewish brethren, his fleshly brothers, would accept Christ. He would wish if it were possible to change places with them, but he might be lost so they could be saved. But that really wasn't possible. I mean, I understand, but the best available option to Paul was to try as hard as he could to persuade them to make what he considered a basic change in how they viewed things, in the hope that he would be able to give them an opportunity, salvation. He hoped that they would believe in Christ. He'd been in their shoes. He knew. And his deepest desire was for them to become as he had become, a follower and believer in Christ. It's important that Paul convinced his Jewish readers that he has no axe to grind with them, but he's totally sympathetic of their plight. He is truly concerned. He fully appreciated who they were and the heritage they enjoyed. His acknowledgement of their unique relationship with God. He was hoping if he pointed that out, that it might put him in a better position to speak directly with them. And so what he does is he talks about some of the advantages the Jews received as a nation. And I don't know if we really pay a lot of attention to that, but there are 9 things in this passage, beginning in verse 4, that the Israelites were uniquely positioned to enjoy. The very first thing is they're Israelites. This idea of being Israelites that concept was cherished by the Jews. It connected them with Jacob, later Israel, and that's where the nation had come from. That was the basic root of the nation. And the promises that were made for the nation were made through Jacob. And so just the idea that they were considered Israelites, that was a positive thing, especially in their minds. Also, they had been regarded as God's sons in a way that was different from all other nations. Exodus 4:22 and Deuteronomy 7:6, they confirm that idea. The third thing was they had received honor, glory from the Lord in many ways as he manifested his recognition of Israel's special place for all nations to see. When you talked about the Israelites to other nations, it to them was a big deal. You remember how they went through the land of Canaan and conquered all of these different cities. Their reputation and the very name caused these large cities to quake, to be afraid, as they had the right to be. And God's covenants, the agreements that he made, had been offered to the Israelites and nobody else. God didn't make any deals or arrangements with anybody else but the Israelites. Now, promises had been made to Abraham, but the whole world would actually share in some of those promises. Genesis 12:3 and Genesis 22:18 talk about those if you want to dig those up. Other pledges, if you will, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob would relate to only people who were called by Jacob's name, and they had been separated from other nations to receive blessings that were intended only for them. So these were the kind of agreements or covenants that would give Israel, the nation of Israel, some dependence upon a spiritual security. In other words, their station in life was such that they, as a nation and a people, enjoyed a special place. Moses' law on Mount Sinai, it had been given to them in a transaction that gave close contact between Moses and God. There's no place else that you can read now since that time that God had such close contact with his people. And so the contents of the law and the events that were associated with the giving of the law at Sinai, that really highlighted the God's special regard that he had for that nation. It talks about the service of God, first in the tabernacle and later in the temple, was really impressive. And so the appointments, the ceremonies, the elaborate wearing apparel, remember the description of the priest's garb, and I mean, this was all minutely detailed, and all of the extensive rules and regulations that govern the service to God that was given by the Jews in the temple and in the tabernacle, those basically, they kind of say, this is important. This is important that we're doing this. And so by their service, they were singularly recognized. There were numerous, promises made to God, to his people at different times and under different circumstances. One of the ones that's notable is found in Leviticus 26:12. It says, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I mean, how better can it get? When it talks about the patriarchs, there were a lot of fathers in Jewish history that they were very proud of. Hebrews chapter 11, we call it the Hall of Faith, but it presents a lot of these people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. They stand head and shoulders above all the rest who are listed. They were the stars of Israel. And other people aren't spoken about like they are. Then there are others listed in there, and their demonstration and submission of God's will was held before the world in Hebrews as being worthy of every man to emulate. You want to find some people you should act like? Here they are. And probably the greatest singular tribute that could be given to Israel was that Jesus was himself a physical Jew. In other words, the Redeemer, the Messiah, came from the Jewish bloodline. That was incredible, and a point that Paul wanted to get the Jews to understand, But Paul's primary objective is to get Christ's true identity before the Jews and the Gentiles. And this is the challenge that Paul has. So, now, you're a Jewish reader and you're following along in Paul's letter, and you're thinking about some things as you run across these ideas that Paul's been introducing. Now understand that this letter followed up some things that had already been shared verbally and by other people. So in some cases, this is kind of a summary, if you will, of Paul's ideas as it pertains to the Christians in Rome. But as we know, most of Paul's letters were generally presented in such a way that the message could apply to any one of the Christian organizations, churches in Rome, and much of it, if not all of it, still applies today. So a Jewish reader would be concerned, confused, that anyone could even consider that their rich heritage was useless in the search of salvation. Think about all these things that Paul's brought up to them. But he says, in spite of your heritage, in spite of all of the things that you have earned as the nation of Israel, that is not going to help you with regard to eternal salvation. And so they might logically think, well, if God's promises were made to Israel, and if, Paul, you say that Israel does not stand to realize these promises, then they'll say, well, God's word failed in its fulfillment. The promises that were so precious to all of the Jews, they're completely worthless. Well, this is what the average Jew's probably thinking about. And it's what the leaders came back on and said, well, if this happened, Paul, what you really did is you said all that stuff that God did in preparation was a waste and it was not true. But that's really not what Paul is saying. Paul's response to that line of reasoning is kind of blunt. Tommy?
Even in their history, Ishmael had nothing to do with the Israelite people, yet he was the seed of Abraham.
Well, that's interesting.
He had his own nation.
And that's exactly where we're going with this.
So there's always been a remnant.
There's always been a part. And even as Micah, recognized that.
So there's always been this one small remnant. Not all the other people in the Israelite nation got blessed.
And that's what he's saying in this passage, because what he says here is, how could somebody contest the physical identity of men born to Jewish parents and lived within a Jewish culture? But what Paul says is here, not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And that's what Tommy's talking about. Ishmael was the firstborn, but he wasn't born to Rebekah. He wasn't born to Sarah. And so God had other plans. What Paul's getting ready to do is say, God has a plan, and he's in charge, and he can make the decisions that he wants to. And so those claiming to be Abraham's seed, not all of them can claim that distinction because there were two lines.
I think that's the reason why Jesus was listed last in those long lists of things that God had given them. Here is now your last remnant through Jesus.
Yeah, if you remember all the genealogical lists and everything, it kind of tied all together. Jesus is at the end, and Tommy, like Tommy is saying, this is your last chance.
As far as Jesus goes, his mother was Jewish, but his father was God, right?
Yes, and his physical father was selected as a Jew as well. So we understand basically so Jesus' mother was a Jew, and if you follow back through the lineage that are recorded in the Gospels, there are two kind of distinct, one that kind of tracks through his mother's bloodline, and then there's another one that tracks back through, people say it's his father's bloodline, but actually it's not specifically true, but it shows that Jesus is ultimately the only path that they could get to. And so it establishes that regardless of which route you take, Jesus is still the culmination of that path. And so what happens is that when he talks about, the lineage, that lineage is deep-rooted national pride. It is a big thing. And so he's almost saying, he says, this means that it is not the children of flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. So what he's trying to do, and when he talked about through Isaac, that's out of Genesis 21:12, he basically starts there from their own Torah to build his argument. It's by God's choice, who will and will not be saved under the gospel dispensation. Human will and human action play no role in that determination. In other words, man cannot make that, it's not up to man. It's up to God. And so this is what he's trying to tell them. It's Isaac, not Ishmael, that was the basis of the seed. Abraham had a child other than Isaac that could have qualified, but God said no. That's not the first time God said no, and it wasn't the last time. It was God's arbitrary choice that it would be through Isaac and not another. Can't come through any other but Isaac. A selection had to be made to implement the physical events, and that's the genealogies we talked about, and not by Ishmael, not by anybody else, only by Isaac could the physical seed appear. So even though Abraham had Ishmael, none of that mattered from this perspective. The Jews, of course, they were proud that they could claim to be descended from Isaac and not from Ishmael. And of course, we know a lot about what happens after that. So the Israelites, they suppose that their physical or fleshly credentials as Abraham's progeny, that's the children of the flesh, would also qualify them to be heirs, children of God, of the spiritual promises made long before to the father of the Jewish nation. But fleshly heritage, physical heritage, that did not ensure their salvation any more than being a descendant of Ishmael would have. And so all the things that they'd been taught growing up and throughout their past really didn't mean anything. And that's very hard for them to understand. And Paul is disturbed that they have found this focus and tried to rely so much on this seed as their salvation. And so, it wasn't left up to Abraham which son would inherit. It was left up to God. God made that choice, and he made it for his own good reasons. And so the children of the flesh and the children of the promise were two different peoples according to God's selection. And if we read passages throughout the New Testament, Christians are the true children of promise. In Galatians 6:16, they're called the Israel of God. In Galatians 3:29, they're called Abraham's seed. In Philippians 3:3, they're called the children of the true circumcision. These are all references to Christians. Romans 2, which we've already read, talked about Christians being a Jew inwardly. 1 Peter 2:9, non-Pauline reference, they're the chosen. And Galatians 3:7 says Christians are the true children of Abraham. Throughout the New Testament, the heritage of Christians are put above the physical heritage of the Jewish nation. Fleshly descent means nothing, no matter what heritage they might have. Just because my father was a member of the church and his father was a member of the church and his father does not guarantee my salvation. That doesn't solve any problems for me. And you have to seek to be numbered with the true children of promise. That's what we have to do. It's up to us being me, you, individuals, our salvation depends on us. And so that is sometimes a bit of a problem. So, it's important that Isaac's birth be recognized as a result of God's promise. So the Lord told Abraham, this is something we sometimes miss, but I'll return to thee at this time. In other words, he said, I'm going to come back in a year or so, and, what I told you is going to come to pass. It kind of looks like a very specific time was appointed for God's promise that Sarah would have a child to come to fruition. There was a time. There was an opportunity. According to Philip Pendleton, he talks about this parallel between the time setting of Isaac's birth and the forecast that accompanied the birth of Christ. And he went to Daniel 9 and shows that Isaac stands as a figure, a type of the Messiah. And they were both distinguished as the seed of promise. And so he kind of looks at this and says, this is not new. This has happened before. And so what Paul is trying to do is show that there were two promises made to Abraham and to his posterity. And the first was the physical blessing or promise of physical blessings. And the second was a spiritual promise that would bring spiritual blessings. So there were two sides to the promise that God made to Abraham. And the most important one had to be the righteousness by faith. In other words, as long as you keep my commandments, you do what I've said, you follow the guidance that I provided you, you will receive rich blessings and your family will be blessed. And so the first was made with Abraham's fleshly descendants, and as long as they fulfilled the agreement throughout the history of the Jewish people, there would be a benefit to doing that. It wasn't made to the entire nation of Israel, nor was it made exclusively to them. God's purpose from the very beginning, believe it or not, was to include the Gentiles along with the Jews. And so, if you look at Genesis 12:3 and Hosea 2:23, you find God always had a plan for the Gentiles. It may have taken a while to materialize, but he always had a plan. But the promise of the seed was made to individual believers, not to a favored nation. The people that keep the agreement, the people that maintain the faith, the people that do this, they're the ones who will obtain the promise. The ones that fall out, they won't have it. Ishmael was a good example. God did not determine that the promise would come through Ishmael. Now, could Ishmael have become a favored person? Perhaps. He didn't give it a chance. But the concept that this spiritual seed, Paul's saying there were actually, two sides to this. Well, this idea of this spiritual seed would have been devastating to the Jewish nation, because the key to their salvation, if you will, which really wasn't at the time, it was that they had to maintain this identity and faith as descendants of Abraham. Yes, I know this is a little complicated to follow, but Paul's trying to say God always had this plan. It was always the plan to make this available to all mankind. And so, in order to make his point, salvation is based on more than just a physical pedigree, a heritage. Paul pursues a matter that God's right to choose for himself is paramount. God selects who will be heirs of salvation. Man doesn't select that. You and I don't select that. He had chosen Israel to receive his physical benefits, and other people were excluded. Lots of other people were excluded. The Jews, of course, they didn't have any problem with this because they were the benefactors of this agreement with Abraham. But it was physical in nature. And of course, they didn't charge God with any unfairness. They weren't out there saying, well, how come the Canaanites didn't get this deal? And how come the Philistines didn't get this deal? And how come, they weren't worried about that, not in the least. As long as they were the focus and the center of attention, they were okay with that. And so, what Israel had to understand is that God is also just in exercising his right to choose the recipients of his spiritual blessings. God chooses. And if you're not among the chosen, you're not among the chosen. And that had to be challenging for them to get around. There's no question in my mind that this is hard. Jacob and Esau, they were of identical parentage. Esau, in keeping with custom and practice, should have become the prime recipient of Isaac's blessings. But we know it didn't work out that way. It didn't happen. God selected Jacob as the twin that the promise of the seed would flow through. Esau was excluded. They talk about the process and understand that God made that choice. Physically, from a heritage perspective, Esau would have received the blessing in the greater portion. That isn't how it happened. God decided that Jacob would be the brother who was appointed by God as the father, both of a physical nation and the Messiah. That is through whom the promise flowed. A choice was essential. It didn't discriminate against Esau, but the spiritual process, it was not affected by that. God's selection was of a physical nation, not of an individual. So this blessing and promise went through to a nation, not an individual. Sarah was told that Esau would serve Jacob before they were born. So that kind of suggested this long-range plan that Jacob's heirs would benefit. There's no record of Esau actually serving Jacob during their lifetimes, but sometimes the reverse happened. But eventually, Edom, those were the descendants of Esau, were subjected to Israel many times. In retrospect, Malachi observes that in God's scheme, Jacob had been loved and Esau had been hated. And so, and don't think of loved as loved is chosen, hated is not chosen. So God chose Jacob and did not choose Esau. That's really what that passage is saying. The declaration that, Jacob would be the thread through which the Messiah would come, that really did not have any bearing on the spiritual destiny of either son. Tommy?
Both sons knew that one or the other would carry on this great responsibility that God had for them, this remnant. And we know via the stories that Esau had a very cavalier attitude toward, well, I'll just sell my blessing for a bowl of porridge here tonight. That blessing doesn't mean anything to me. And therefore, it's kind of easy to see why God would say, okay, all the way up, this guy has been really cavalier. We're going to do a reverse and give it to Jacob.
And so what Tommy's talking about is Esau's attitude. Oh, so what? I give this away or I give that away. It's a big deal. It doesn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything till the end. And then it meant something. But, up to that point, Esau had such a cavalier attitude. But understand that before either twin was born, God had already told Sarah that the promise would come through Jacob. She already knew that. And so it doesn't suggest the fact that this did not carry through the spiritual destiny for either son. It doesn't really suggest, a decision about salvation, hadn't been made. it's just an interesting perspective. So it really confirms that God has the right to choose. It's God's decision. We need to always remember that, which sometimes we tend to not focus on. All right. So, the question that comes up again, is God unfair to the Jewish nation in the face of promises made to it? Because he decided to grant justification and righteousness to only Jews who accept Jesus as Son and Savior, but also to Gentiles who accept Jesus as Son and Savior, the spiritual family. In other words, God chooses. Paul's saying, what do we say? Is it injustice on God's part? No, certainly not. It is not injustice on God's part. Moses, if you recall, he once asked to see the glory of Jehovah, who was not under any obligation to grant the request. However, he complied. God complied with Moses' request, not from a debt, not because he owed it to Moses, but from his grace. In other words, he allowed that to happen. Exodus 33:19, he proclaimed that his authority was not to be questioned in any manner. And God decided. Paul goes back through history, he says, God says, I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. So it doesn't depend upon human will or exertion, but on God. Who has mercy? God has mercy. That's who has mercy. And because God has mercy, he can choose to extend it to the Jews who believe and to the Gentiles who believe in equal portion. And that's where people got upset. There might even be this thread hanging through here that talks a little bit about, who was willed and who was not willed. But, Sarah, if you recall, she tried to expedite God's promise through Hagar. In other words, she tried to change the process. Well, she couldn't change that. What she wanted, what she desired, what she thought she was going to get, that didn't impact God's ultimate decision. What about Pharaoh, which is what they're talking about here, Pharaoh, he was a very powerful ruler, and he was capable of controlling the Jews who lived in Egypt and did. But, Pharaoh was raised up by Jehovah for two reasons. One was to become God's tool for demonstrating his absolute power over the conduct of human will and human activity. That is what God raised Pharaoh up for. And he raised Pharaoh up to allow God's name, nature, to be declared throughout the earth. This example that he made of Pharaoh, he did on purpose. He made those decisions on purpose. God chose to harden Pharaoh's heart to accomplish both purposes with which he wanted to extract. So, Rahab and the Gideonites, they testified as to the dread put into the hearts of the nations that the Israelites encountered. That was a big deal. And so, those events that followed all of that came as a part of their heritage. But ultimately, and this is where we can't get lost, ultimately it was God's decision. The contest in Egypt between Moses and the Israelites against Pharaoh and the Egyptians was, a very good illustration of Paul's concept. God has compassion on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. In other words, it's God's choice. And so this idea, their will of the Jews, the idea that, making these choices, well, the Jews, particularly the Jewish leaders, they wanted to seek righteousness via the law. And that wasn't possible. You know, God's will was to confer righteousness by faith and grace. And so, even though Israel had been given every opportunity to know and to accept the gospel, like Pharaoh, they ignored it, they abused it whenever they could, and as a result, those Jewish leaders, they'd become hardened to the truth of their salvation. And this is what Paul's saying. You know, there is this idea about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's kind of been a prime resource for the Calvinists, because what they've done is they've talked about the unchangeable election of individuals. And we're not going to go into Calvinism here, but just to say that that's one of the things they kind of hang their hat on. But their theory flies in the face of every biblical teaching that man is a free agent to make his own decisions about the welfare of his soul, and there are numerous passages throughout the New Testament they can find that. So, you know, again, the Jews who were in hearty support of the choices Jehovah made in Egypt, they weren't willing to accept the choices that God now presented to them, because they would have defended God's fairness in dealing with Pharaoh, but they're not willing to accept God's fairness in dealing with them and the Gentiles. You can't have it both ways. You know, there's an old proverb that says, the same sun that hardens the clay melts the wax. Through the means of the gospel, God hardens the hearts of some and melts the hearts of others. Those who accept his offer and obey the requirements of the gospel, they'll be saved, selected, favored. Those who reject it, they're lost. So we want to strive to be on the favored side. Tommy?
And even God rejected that. The prophets, when it said the Jewish nation will be stiff-necked and stubborn, didn't matter what God was trying to tell them to do about Jesus. They were still stuck in their ledge. And by God, that's what they were going to stay with.
Yeah, as Tommy says, there were some Jews who were willing to accept this basic change. But there were so many who were so stuck in their heritage and in the law, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it, no matter how hard they tried. I think the second bell went, so I have to quit. So thank you so much for your comments and your attention this morning, and we'll pick it up again next week. Have a great week.